I work at SUSE, and this is about being an effective code contributor for beginning contributors. And hopefully for OpenStack, but hopefully any open source project. I've been involved with OpenStack for about 3 years. I used to be a core reviewer for the Papa modules team, and I'm now a core reviewer for a subgroup in the infra team and also a core on the Keystone team. And I wanted to give this talk because I sort of see the same problems over and over, where new contributors found something to fix and they write up the change and you make it through all this crazy account creating process and you finally get your patch submitted, and then the patch just takes weeks or months to merge and you don't know why. And for some really like major changes, that's expected. OpenStack's this big machine. There's these big ideas and those types of things take a long time for all the moving parts to come together, but this isn't really about those types of changes. This is about just basic bug fixes, documentation changes, really simple features, and those types of things that take an unnecessarily long time to merge or become orphaned because the contributor got too frustrated by the process. There's lots of things that we can do on the experienced developer side to make this process easier, but I'm here to talk about what you as new contributors can do on your side to try to make these things less painful. I care about this a lot because I love OpenStack and I want it to succeed, and I think retaining new contributors and making this stuff easier is a big part of that. So one of OpenStack's founding tenets is that is open code review. It's part of that open development, part of the 4 opens. We want excellent quality code, and the only realistic way to achieve that is to actually have multiple sets of human eyeballs actually looking at the code and figuring it out and processing it and making sure it's good. So we allow and encourage anyone and everyone to review code. It's not just cores, it's everybody. And having that back and forth discussion on how best to solve a problem is an absolutely critical part of code review that you should embrace, and you should even look forward to it. But a side effect of this code review culture is that we tend to come at it from a perspective of reject first. We want to protect our projects from bad code, so we turn it into a sort of a game of finding as many things wrong as possible. As an example of the kinds of things that I want to help with today, this was a patch in Keystone that was supposed to make some readability enhancements to the docs, and it ended up going through 12 patch sets before being merged, which in the grand scheme of things, 12 is not that many compared to a lot of patches, a lot of projects, but for this small change to the docs, it was kind of unnecessary. The author ended up losing patience with this, and the patch was finished by someone else. And the problem with changes like this is that the scope and the problem aren't well defined up front, and so the reviewers come at it and they can't agree on whether this is solving a problem or what the problem was and whether this is fixing it. And so what I kind of want you to come away with is the ability to fast forward past some of these easy targets that churn through these first few patch sets and get to that meaningful discussion or just having an easy patch merged quickly. And so writing good commit messages is basically 90% of what I want to talk about today, because for the most part, I can't really tell you how to write better code, and that's what code review is for, is getting better code. But commit messages are an incredibly important part of any software project, but especially for open source projects, because it just helps get everyone reviewing your code on the same page from the start. So what I started learning when I was an intern and what I take with me with every patch I write is this basic format. It's pretty basic. Maybe you've heard of it or you've seen it before, but I know from reviewing a lot of code that a lot of people haven't seen this. So this is where we're going to start. The subject is maybe obviously what changed in this commit. And then the body of the commit message is going to have at least 3 sentences, maybe more. You start out by describing the state of the world as it is today without this patch applied. And this is where you talk about the bug you noticed, the symptoms you saw, or you talk about the fact that this project is lacking this particular feature. And then you make your case for why this is a problem. It's not just enough to say the bug's a problem because it's a bug. You should actually make the case that this affected you somehow or could affect someone else. Or just, the world is in this state of misery because we're lacking this feature. That should be in the commit message. And then finally, you explain how you solve the problem. You describe the changes you made to avert this bug, or you describe how this new parameter works, or how this new driver enables this feature. You don't need to restate what's in the code if it's clear in the code, but a lot of code is not that clear and deserves a good explanation. So my commit messages almost always have these exact 3 phrases in them. Without this patch, this is a problem because this patch solves the problem by. And it's not particularly creative or pretty writing, but it communicates a lot. So this is a really old example from Keystone of something that I don't want you to do. It does not say what the bug was, and even if you look at the code that was changed, it's not obvious what the bug was or how it was fixed. And it doesn't make the case that this bug was affecting anybody at all. Maybe the world could have gone on with this bug in there forever. So please don't write commits like this. This is a more recent example of, from Keystone again, of what I think is a really great commit message. The subject says what changed. The body starts out by describing how things were without that change and why that's a problem. And then the last part describes how the change fixes the problem. So I think this is a really good model to follow. So besides getting your code to merge faster, writing good commit messages is really important for software history. So a lot of time we're looking to refactor or clean up old code, and we need to remember why something was added so we can determine if it's still important. And without good commit messages, important code could get removed, or on the other side of things, unimportant code could stick around way after it's lost its welcome because we're just afraid to touch it. And so you're not only providing context for other people, you could be reminding yourself why this thing is there. And so this is an example of a change that was made a few years ago in the infrastructure config management repo. And what I like about this commit is it just shows, it has the context for why this change was made. We wanted to add support for Fedora 18 for something. But now it's 4 years later, we dropped support for Fedora 18, and so while we were doing some refactoring, we figured out, we don't need this anymore. We can just drop it entirely. And so this was a really valuable commit, it was a valuable commit and then a valuable commit message, so we can drop the code. On the other hand, in Keystone land, there was a few sets of changes that weren't really well explained, and that started causing some problems. So we had this variable, is admin project set to true, and then there was this comment, but the comment didn't really provide enough detail to explain what was going on, and the commit message didn't explain it further either. And then as a small part of some other bigger change, we added this sort of cryptic comment. This seems inherently dangerous. We should figure out how to set this to false. And that actually just sort of made things more uncertain because we don't know what the context is here. And then finally, someone noticed that comment and said, well, I'll just fix that. I decided to change the default because they were lacking context for why it was the way it was. And that ended up breaking some things and causing some RBAC work that was building on this to slow down and have to fix this. So this change ended up getting reverted because the person who was around and did have context caught it and was able to fix it, but that was kind of lucky. And so if you have any kind of long-term involvement with a project, or you're going to learn to appreciate commit messages because they're going to prevent problems like this. So besides the general structure of the commit message, there's a few more things that I'd like to say about them. So when we write code internally, even if we have code review at our companies, at our teams, and not everyone does, but even when we do, we sort of get into these bad habits of not explaining ourselves properly, because when we're working on a small team, We know it's in the sprint, we know it's been prioritized, we're all sort of heading in the same direction. We know all of our teammates, we trust that I know this at least as well as my teammate knows this. And so we let each other get away with bad commit messages, bad explanations in commit messages. And that's not good internally, but it translates really, really badly to a global multi-company project like OpenStack. It's pulling in 100 different directions. Someone who's never met you doesn't trust that you know what you're doing, and they probably have a completely different idea of what's important. And this is sort of why a lot of new people tend to feel like OpenStack has this clique problem, because that trust is not yet built. And so in my mind, a commit message is not just about what the change is and how it solves a problem. A commit message is a fierce argument for why the previous state of the world was suboptimal and why your change is the best solution to this problem. People on the internet don't know you, and they don't know your credentials, and they don't take for granted that you probably know what you're doing. You have to convince them that you've researched this problem and you've tested it thoroughly and that you've considered other options and that you still think this is the best one. So you have to explain your personal use case for the feature or the environment that you saw this bug. And even if your code isn't perfect, if you're framing your message in this way, it helps the reviewer understand where you're coming from. And from that perspective, they can start offering suggestions on how to improve the code rather than arguing about whether you're even having a real problem. And so it helps to preemptively predict questions that reviewers might ask and answer them in your commit message. Why did you do it this way? Or why did you make this change that looks totally unrelated? And explain that. And if you start out your proposal with this kind of certainty and evidence, your reviewers are going to be carried away by your argument. They're going to be less likely to debate you on the why and focus on the how. So long commit messages, in my opinion, are totally okay, although I think that's slightly up for debate. But in my opinion, verbosely explaining yourself, thoroughly explaining yourself, is the key to level setting. And it's worked out pretty well for me so far. Without getting specific, I'll give you an example from the Keystone Auth library. There was a change up for review that would sort of drastically change some of the default behavior around how Keystone Auth was dealing with the requests library. And it's been sitting there for a while. It's been sitting there for months now because no one was really sure what to do with it. We couldn't figure out exactly why to reject it outright, but it sort of made us uneasy. And the author wasn't able to make a really compelling argument for why it needed to change. They just sort of said, well, it needs to change. And at this point, it's still kind of hanging. It's probably going to keep hanging unless the author starts engaging and it manages to make a compelling argument. On the other side of that, this is one of my commits that I'm sort of proud of. I know you can't see the text of the commit. The point is that it's a very long commit, and it's for a 2-line change in the PyOpenSSL library. The gist is that I explained in detail what the bug was and how to reproduce it, and also how it was negatively affecting users, which was it was causing Python to segfault. And it provided context for the bug, since we found out while trying to use glance, and it was causing glance to fall over. So reviewers could understand that I was using the library in a supported way and not doing something crazy with it. And I preemptively answered some questions that could have been asked about it. Does it happen with other size keys? Does it happen with different types of keys? And that type of thing. The steps to reproduce the bug, that probably could have gone in a bug report. That would have been fine. But it's still important to summarize in the commit message what the bug is. And it's still important to summarize in the commit message what the bug is and explain the context. And so when I wrote this, I never contributed to this library before. I didn't know any of the maintainers. And I know all these people are a whole lot smarter than me, but with this commit, I was able to show that I understood the problem really well and that I'd come up with a good solution. And this was merged within a day. And so if you're structuring your commit messages in this way, it'll get you really deeply thinking about the problem. You know, is it really a problem? Is it a problem for everybody or just for me? Is it objectively a problem, or is it just sort of a personal distaste? And if you're thinking about it in these terms, then it's likely that the code is going to be of higher quality and you're going to be more prepared for the discussion about the code. And so I can finish up the commit message rant by leaving you. This is Wiki page on OpenStack's conventions for Git commit messages. And it summarized some of the points that I've made here. And I'll jump into some other tips about making good code submissions. So one of those things is writing small contained patches. So you can write multiple related patches, but it's still important to break them up into small logical units. A major problem with how humans do code review is that huge changes will either never get reviewed because no one has time to spend hours looking at this massive change, or it gets sort of a lazy +1. You know, yes, that is indeed code. I've looked at it and that looks like code to me. Because your eyes just sort of glaze over, you stop being able to discern what the change is even about. And so you can look out for signs that your change is too big. If your commit message has a lot of bullet points or uses phrases that start with also, that could be a candidate to separate into separate commits. So this is one of my changes that I tried to make, where you can see that I tried to do 5 different things in this one commit because my logic at the time was all these 5 things were needed in order to fix the subject. The problem was the Beaker is the functional testing library for Puppet, and all of these things were broken with the functional tests, and I needed to fix all of them at once. And so yeah, when I wrote this, it made sense to cram it into one commit, but I was finding that people were having a hard time reviewing it. It was too big, and they had problems with some parts, but they didn't have problems with others. And so I ended up breaking this up into 4 or 5 different commits, and that was a whole lot easier for people to deal with. Next thing is testing your code. You're almost always going to need to write tests for your code. This is just going to be one of the first things reviewers ask for if you don't do it up front. And the test, it's important to exercise the problem. So tests need to be written in such a way that without your change, the test fails. And then something that goes along with this is please run your code in some sort of actual environment. It can be a lab environment, but please actually run the code. I've reviewed code a lot where I go to test it out and I'm thinking I'll just find some corner cases with it, and it turns out the code doesn't work at all. It doesn't even deploy. And in my opinion, that's sort of embarrassing. If you've written this great commit message and you've convinced me that you know what you're doing, and then your code falls flat on its face, that's not great. So please just run your code and add unit tests and add functional tests if necessary. And that will go a long way. Documentation is super important. If you're adding anything, it needs to be documented. The obvious case is if you're adding a feature, you need to update the project documentation to talk about that feature. But even if you're doing something like adding a new public function to a class that needs a doc string to describe it for the other developers, or if you're just doing anything that's kind of clever or non-obvious that needs a code comment too, and that also counts as documentation. And that is also something that reviewers are going to be looking for and asking for. And then the last thing that reviewers might ask for, in that you could get ahead of sometimes, is release notes. If you're adding a feature or fixing a bug, and it's more than just a trivial fix, and certainly if you're changing any default behavior, it'll need a release note. And we have this awesome tool called Reno. It'll help you generate release notes. You can read up on how to use it. And yeah, please do. And so even if you've done all this perfectly and you have a great commit message and you have docs and tests and release notes and everything like that, it's still almost definitely not going to be merged in one patch set. There's going to be a dialogue that happens and people are going to discuss it, and there will be lots of changes to your original idea. then that's fine. On the other hand, sometimes it happens that a patch might kind of sit for a while without getting any reviews. So if you're not getting timely feedback on your patches, my advice is to go to the project team on IRC. And in some cases, you might need to be prepared to check in at a time that's inconvenient for your time zone. But sometimes a patch just gets buried by other changes. It just sort of falls through the cracks. Or it could be that even if you have this great commit message, your code was too complicated for people to review and they just sort of shied away from it. So reaching out to the community it's a good way to get attention for your patch, or also figure out why it fell through the cracks, and to show that you're engaged and you're willing to work with people to get the problem solved. So when you reach out to people on IRC, there's a couple of guidelines to help facilitate that communication. The first thing is no naked pings. What that means is pinging someone on IRC channel just out of the blue and not providing any context for what you want, just seeing if they're around. And that's a problem because OpenStack is a global community. So if the person you're pinging is asleep or not around, by the time they see your ping and respond, you might have gone to sleep, you might have left, and then you spent a whole day doing this round trip without being able to ask your question. And in a similar vein there, don't ask to ask, meaning don't ask whether it's okay to ask a question, don't ask whether this is the right place to ask a question, just go ahead and ask the question. If you're asking to ask instead of just being direct, then first of all, you have that round trip problem again, where getting an answer might take double the time that's really necessary. But another problem is that if people don't know the context, they don't necessarily want to commit to being invested in a problem that they can't solve. So they might just not respond. They might just sort of ignore you because they don't know what your problem is, and it could be totally unrelated to what they have the ability to solve. On the other hand, if you explain your context up front, then everyone is immediately on the same page, and if someone can help, they usually will. But you might need to be prepared to stick around for a while. Even without this round trip problem, that sometimes might take a while to get a response. And a lot of the time I'll see someone ask for help and then they immediately quit. And I haven't even, in that time I hadn't even seen the question. So you don't have to set up an IRC bouncer or anything, but just be prepared to leave your connection running for a little while. And we're always happy to help, but we can't do that if you've disconnected. And so that leads me to my last point about code contributions, is to follow through on your change. See it through to the end. Be watchful and responsive to CI and to reviews, because it's your responsibility to follow through on your own patch until some sort of decision's been reached and the commit is merged. So be accepting, be humble to criticism, constructive criticism, because code review is a dialogue, and continuing to follow through, continuing to be responsive, that shows that you care about this change, that it's important to you, and that will make it important to other people. So my last piece of advice to leave with is to keep in mind that open development model. Anyone can review code, and that includes new contributors. And the more you review other people's code, the better you are going to understand what reviewers are looking for when you submit code. But I have a couple of rules about that. Don't leave a +1 vote for code that you don't understand. It's not really that helpful. And don't leave a -1 for nitpicks or for questions. It's perfectly okay to leave comments and questions without voting on a change at all. You can just leave a +0, even if Stackalytics doesn't count those. It's totally fine. And asking questions on reviews is a great way to show engagement and to learn about the project and about the change. The way to give valuable feedback on a review is to actually try out the change. Learn why there was a problem before, and test out the change and see that this change fixes it. You'll be learning about the code and providing worthwhile input to the author and to the core reviewers who are going to end up approving this change. And that's about all I have. Almost all of this should translate to other open source projects, so feel free to keep it in mind even if you're not working on OpenStack. And feel free to reach out to me because I'm also on the TC and I'm really interested in how people, those of us in governance, leadership positions can make this contribution experience a better experience. And I'm wondering if there are any questions or discussion points in the room that we could address now. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming.